There's a rose that grows on no man's land, and it's wonderful to see. Though it's sprayed with tears, it will live for years in my garden of memories. It's the one red rose a soldier knows. It's the work of the master's hand. 'Neath the war's great curse stands the Red Cross nurse. She's the rose of no man's land. That was one of his favorites.
Miss Anderson?
Yes.
My name is Dr. Tim Westcott. I'm calling from the George S. Robb Center for the Study of the Great War here at Park University in Kansas City, Missouri. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you?
I believe your great-grandfather fought in World War I. Is that correct?
Correct.
Our center is to perform a systematic review of African Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, Jewish Americans, and Native Americans that fought during World War I for a possible elevation to the Medal of Honor. Have you heard about the project before?
In this company, we hear again in our minds the sound of distant battles.
We are a nation, a people, who remember our heroes. We take seriously our responsibilities to only send them when war is necessary. We strive to care for them and their families when they come home. We never forget their sacrifice.
Their spectacular moments of supreme testing summoned a degree of courage that echoes those words that describe the heights of bravery in war.
Gallantry at the risk of one's life above and beyond the call of duty.
They left us decades ago, before we could give them the full recognition that they deserved.
Freedom will be forever in their debt.
It sometimes takes a long time to get things right.
But it's never too late to say thank you.
Kansas City for your morning commute. Our weather today, not bad. Partly to most.
Number one adult sound in Kansas City.
Straight up.
Downtown Kansas City, mostly dry.
PRS Kansas City.
Park University students and a professor are taking on a mission.
Park University's Tim Westcott leading a team researching military records of men who were recommended for the Medal of Honor but didn't get one, mainly because of their race.
I usually leave the house around 6 a.m., arrive on campus, 6:30, 6:45. I love Kansas City, it's great. I mean, great suburbs, great food, great entertainment. I came here in 1984, never left. I served 8 years in the United States Marine Corps. Marine Corps paid for my undergraduate education here in Kansas City. I started at Park University in the late 1990s, and then went into the Department of History as full-time faculty. In a class setting, I became more aware of the students, alumni from Park College that were killed during World War I. So I began to do some research and came across the fact that Park College, at the time, actually had a Medal of Honor recipient. And with the Medal of Honor being, the highest Medal of Valor that this country can give, I wanted to know more.
Please welcome Director of Strategic Communications at Park University, Bridget Locke.
Hello, everyone. It is indeed an honor to spend the evening talking about Park's Road to the World War I Valor Medals Review, where those who valiantly defended our nation in the Great War are remembered and their stories are told.
Dr. Westcott introduced this concept to me several years ago. There's been this type of systematic review for other wars, but not for those that served in World War I.
It had been done for every other major conflict that the United States was involved in. And here we are, 100+ years later, to embark on that.
When we learned about the Valor Medal Review, this looked very worthwhile to us to ensure that our nation's veterans are never forgotten. We met with Park University officials and made a pledge to support the Robb Center.
A lot of people have said, well, why Park University? And really the connection was George Robb.
A Park University alumnus who led the mostly black 369th Regiment, 93rd Division of New York. Lieutenant Robb's service eventually led to his receipt of the Medal of Honor for extraordinary heroism.
You know, you have a white officer, George Robb, winning the Medal of Honor, and literally on the same document, right below him, is virtually the same recommendation for Sergeant Butler, an African American soldier out of Maryland that served alongside and with George Robb, who ultimately was downgraded and didn't receive the award.
Sergeant William Butler served with the renowned all-black 369th Infantry Regiment during World War I. His heroism made headlines after he killed at least 5 Germans while rescuing 5 Americans who had been taken prisoner. Butler received the Distinguished Service Cross and France's highest military honor, but not the U.S. Medal of Honor.
The Croix de Guerre and Distinguished Service Cross were the highest honors afforded to African American soldiers in World War I. In support of the effort to have Sergeant Butler's Medal of Honor recommendation reconsidered, Dr. Sammons, a very accomplished author, lecturer, activist, and professor, compiled a thick stack of evidence.
No black received a Medal of Honor in World War I.
Professor Jeffrey Sammons of New York University says that's largely because of a concerted and well-documented effort by senior white officers to denigrate the performance of black soldiers.
They could do anything but fight. They have, in fact, been dangerous to no one except themselves and women.
Sammons has joined forces with Professor Timothy Westcott of Park University in Missouri to right what they see as a terrible wrong.
Due in large part to Park's work with Sergeant Butler, Dr. Timothy Westcott and I got invited to Washington, D.C., and eventually became members of the Valor Medals Review Task Force. The time had come for a systematic review on a larger scale, because there were many more stories like Sergeant Butler's to be told.
Does it feel like work to you?
No. You know, there is that somewhat pressure based upon the fact that Congress has given us basically until late 2025 to investigate service members and provide those recommendations to the Department of Defense. And then also just in general, making sure we're in contact with our descendants. But definitely one of our greatest advantages is we have a phenomenal team. Good morning, both. How are you? Ready for another day?
The point of our job is to create an entire life narrative that we can present to the board to recommend somebody for the Medal of Honor.
My name is Ashlyn Weber. I'm the Associate Director at the George S. Robb Center at Park University. In general, I oversee the organization of the Valor Medals Review in terms of the service members who qualify for it.
Ashlyn, for next week's meeting, could you pull the descendant list within 200-mile radius of DC?
My largest role is finding out individuals and keeping track of them throughout their life. Not necessarily on the battlefield, but who they are. So any family members we know that are still around, organizations we know they were a part of. Anybody that goes through our office will have to come through me first, and then it'll go straight to Josh Weston.
My strengths are in my military research, where Ashlyn's is in genealogy. And because of that, we're able to fulfill both sides of the board of this project. My name is Josh Weston. I'm the Senior Military Analyst for the George S. Robb Center. I served with the 101st Airborne Division. I moved to Kansas City about 6 years ago, did a walkthrough of Park University, and I've been stuck ever since. My research begins when Ashlyn confirms the service member. I get the most basic of information on them, date of engagement, their unit, and sometimes that's it. through military records, orders, journals, correspondence. I make all these documents and I call them SOEs, which is Summary of Engagement Events. Break everything down minute by minute, always providing maps and as much visuals as I possibly can. So like a court case, we can build the case to prove that our service members did in fact perform an act of valor on the dates stated.
Josh, how much do you need assistance with mapping and the photography?
Given that we have currently 200 plus service members, I'm definitely going to need some backup.
Park University is working this morning.
This small task force has identified another soldier, this time First Lieutenant Thomas Edward Jones. He received a Distinguished Service Cross for heroic actions in France in 1946.
Rings the music of the spheres. This is my father's world. I rest me in the thought of rocks and trees, of skies and seas, his hands the wondrous wrought. My father had a lot of songs. He was a man who loved words. My family are big word people. Here he is before he goes to war. It's about 1915, and he looks so young and untouched, and not what you look like when you come back. I'm Emma Jones Lepsansky. I am Emeritus Professor of History and Curator of Special Collections at Haverford College. And I'm the daughter of Thomas Edward Jones, who served in the Medical Corps in 1917-18 in France during World War I. This was done by my stepson. And so what he did was take a number of these documents and turn them into a visual story. And it starts with my father graduating from medical school, there in the left corner. That's Distinguished Service Cross there. And the French Croix de Guerre, which is their equivalent of a Distinguished Service Cross. I was born a historian. Even as a little kid, I had 1,000 questions. How come that's like that? And why did that happen? And so I was my father's child. Oh. My brother, born in 1940, my sister, born in 1942, and myself, born in 1945. He had been home from the war almost 40 years by the time he had his first child. He was 60 years old. Even though he was still working as a physician, he bought a bunch of property in black towns, and he bought a farm outside of Washington. He wanted to be a landowner so he could vote. And so I don't know him as a military man, except in some of these pictures. There he is in boot camp, the African American Medical Corps, getting ready to go. Oh, and I made notes from research. On June 5th, 1917, President Wilson called up the Selective Service, hoping to build, train, and equip an army of 1 million men within a year and ship them off to France. So when Wilson stood up and said, "Hey, will you come?" apparently my father, who was then 37 years old, said, "I'll go." All we knew was that he had saved somebody in France on the battlefield in America. And I'm not sure that I have the full story on that. He talks in his diary about the segregated army in 1918, and there's the diary. He's now in France. Days seem perpetual. Broad daylight at 10 p.m. Sun does not set until after 9 p.m. Seems just like the same soil as in U.S., but the peasants are very poor. Retired early and had a sweet rest. Some days, and particularly around the days he got that medal for, he doesn't have anything. He just says it's a day. There he is. There's the French Croix de Guerre, and there's the Distinguished Service Cross. The President of the United States, authorized by Act of Congress July 9, 1918, takes pleasure in presenting the Distinguished Service Cross to First Lieutenant Medical Corps, Thomas Edward Jones. Lieutenant Jones went into an open area subjected to direct machine gun fire to care for a wounded soldier who was being carried by another officer. While dressing the wounded runner, the machine gun bullet passed between his arms and his chest, and a man was killed within a few yards of him. I did know he bore a scar on the inside of his wrist. And I guess the shell came across there. And from time to time, he would rub his wrist.
Many of these guys had amazing lives, but others of them did not get to grow old. In many cases, this is the first time anybody's ever paid attention to many of these individuals. Not just paid attention, but actually said their name out loud in 100 years. This is primarily our archives room, so whenever we receive files from the National Archives, this is primarily where they go. This room is going to have to get bigger at some point or another. I think the greatest surprise was how many service members have ended up being qualified. I could not tell you what I thought was going to be the final number, but it was not over 200. Each of the 5 groups have particular consistencies. African Americans, for example, were in segregated units, so you immediately know that they're in a particular area. Probably the hardest out of all 5 of these groups are Native Americans, mainly because we had to take a step back and just figure out how many of them were in the service to begin with. There are tribes and nations that were still at war with the United States government in terms of land rights, and then were not allowed to be citizens yet. So that took about a year and a half in itself just to curate the Native American list. One of the other hardest groups are Jewish Americans, especially from Eastern Europe, that are coming over into the United States en masse with their parents or just themselves, trying to escape persecution they were facing. We kind of know that they're going to come into the New York area. We know that they're going to go into Ellis Island, but we were kind of unsure as to what consistencies were after that. For the most part, they're staying on the East Coast because it was easier for them to make a home in the area that they had arrived at. That's why you see a large number of Jewish Americans in the 77th Division, the Liberty Division based in New York. During this time period, many of our Hispanic Americans are coming from Mexico. If we look in the Southwest United States, Texas and New Mexico and Arizona, whatever division is closest to there, they probably would have been enlisting at. One of our Hispanic Americans, Army, Mrs. Marcelino Serna, was born in Chihuahua, Mexico, and came over into the States when he was a teenager, was picked up by Immigration Service and was threatened to be sent back to Mexico, but then chose to join the service instead. He goes on to be one of the most celebrated Mexican-American veterans in American history. The other thing we did not know a lot about was just Asian Americans in this country at this time in general. There's not a whole lot of materials and authorship done on Asian Americans to begin with. We ended up finding out that Chinese Americans were coming into the United States in the period before World War I. Once we perform our internal investigation, we can have a huge spectrum of information that's going to be included in the Medal of Honor recommendation packets.
Engine 54 to fire alarm.
Answering engine 54.
We got fire showing. We got a major fire on the 6th floor. Major. You want another ladder truck?
There was a major fire in the National Archives facility at St. Louis in 1973. I could not tell you the exact number of individuals that were affected, but we have several veterans who were affected. When writing the Medal of Honor recommendations, the DoD only wants to see primary sources. So something like this, the whole text of this obviously has been saved and then it hasn't been burnt to a crisp, but there are several pieces that have. I can't see the citation at all, I can't see who signed it, and I can't see the date. Absolutely useless. If I can't see where it comes from, who writes it, and when they wrote it, I can't do anything with it.
Early on in this project, we were able to locate the descendants of a service member, and I just basically made a cold call. Luckily, this young lady picked up the phone, and I introduced myself. I said her grandfather met the criteria to be at least reviewed, and there was dead silence. And I thought, well, we just lost a connection, on the phone. And after maybe, 15, 30 seconds, I could hear weeping in the background. And I asked her, I said, "No, ma'am, are you okay?" And she came back on the line and she said, "We have waited over a century for this to happen."
And then there is New Yorker Lau Sing Kee, born to Chinese immigrants in California.
He was recognized and received the Distinguished Service Cross for his heroism in battle.
If I can bring them in, I'll put them in front of UNB and arrange them. Any particular order?
Save the best for last.
All right.
I'm Beatrice Lau Kee, the youngest daughter of Lau Sing Kee. I have lived in this house since 1975. I was teaching at the Queensborough Community College in the Department of Nursing.
Here are the certificates. This is the Distinguished Service Cross, the Croix de Guerre. My name is Glenn Lau Kee, grandson of Sing Kee. I currently am practicing law, and I served as the president of the New York State Bar Association. And this is my Aunt Beatrice, and here's the picture of the 77th coming back, marching down Broadway. And there's Grandpa right there. We used to imitate him, and he'd say, "What are you doing now?" And we'd all scatter. He was quite a guy. He was about 6 feet tall, imposing character to us. I was very young then, of course. I was his grandson, running around causing all sorts of havoc in his house, but never a word about the war or any medals or anything else.
This is my father and my grandfather. He was the oldest. He was born in 1896. When he came to New York, he was looking for a job. And that's when he enlisted in the Army for World War I. They had 5 children. We lived in Chinatown, and I was the baby. I know he pushed us. He wanted to make sure we all got our education and sacrificed quite a bit for it.
Right here I have Private Kee's information. What I had to do in order to tell his story was go through the 77th Divisional history and their operations, which includes the weather, the terrain, maps, movements, orders at the point of his engagement. For Sing Kee himself, he operated a comm station at Mont Notre Dame, 3-lane information that was vital to hold the line against the Germans. And the Germans were just across the river, and they were shelling the mountain. And even though he was gassed and he was being shelled, he kept manning it virtually by himself throughout the entire night of the 14th to the 15th until it was time to attack a couple of days later for the offensive. Without him manning the comm station, the offensive could have just been completely shut down had the front lines not been established because of Sing Kee's actions. And that's what I have to prove for every single service member, is their actions affected the outcome of the war.
As a kid, I remember we had my father's helmet, his gas masks, and his uniform in a closet. They were just medals to me. I used to go look at them every so often. I'm very proud of my father, even though he never talked about it.
How we learned about most of it pretty much is from being in the books. And of course, then we wanted to know more.
They won the battle by his action. So he got his Distinguished Service Cross. But how come he didn't get the Congressional Medal of Honor? I don't know. Maybe he should have.
One of the most profound things that I've found is the orders from a certain American Expeditionary Forces general, specifically stating to the French not to recognize the African Americans serving within their units. When I came across these documents, I had to sit there for a second and just kind of think about when somebody's serving their country should either support or serve them, whether it's during their service or after. And to have some of the highest commanding entities saying, no, we're not going to award these individuals simply because of the color of their skin, it was unbelievable to come across.
Towering over the Kansas City skyline. To all
Today marks
served.
103 years since the armistice was signed, ending
We're at the World War I Museum today to honor.
The story of the museum and memorial being here in Kansas City, I think, is a great story of grassroots initiative and truly an American story. Soon after the end of the war, the people of Kansas City and the region gathered together and said, let us do something to create a memorial for the war dead of the region and a tribute for peace. Then in 1919, a fundraising campaign over about 10 days raised $2.5 million, the equivalent today of close to $40 million. President Coolidge came back in 26 to dedicate the memorial in front of what was considered to be the largest crowd that a president had ever spoken to, more than 150,000 people. You can't think of the American century without understanding the role that World War I played in bringing the United States out onto the world stage. The minority men and women across the country who made their contribution to end the war, we've got to pay tribute and honor to them.
I'm Jenny Stopani, and these are my sisters, Stacy, Suki, and Gloria. We are descendants of Marcelino Serna, World War I hero, and he's up for review as well.
Granddaughter of George Gross, who was a recipient of the Distinguished Cross.
I am William Warfield's granddaughter, his oldest granddaughter. And we've heard some interesting stories about him.
We're so honored that you're doing this. Thank you.
What's at stake is this will be the last time Congress will grant another opportunity to look at World War I service members. So I think we have to get it right and then make the strongest case for each service member to hopefully be elevated.
Closing the book is very painful because you get to know them on a very personal level. Every day I come over with the feeling that I'm missing somebody for one reason or another. There's nothing I can do about it.
I think that this is the only way to make a difference for my brethren. Even if they served 100 years ago, valor never expires, service never expires in my mind.
I think that, again, when people look at it and say, do we want to go back? It's a difficult conversation, but it couldn't be any more relevant.
Frankly, the work isn't done. There's a lot left to do in ensuring that all Americans who served with valor and made sacrifices are recognized as they should be recognized.
It's one of a number of projects that I think can help Americans see our history as not two-dimensional, can see nuance.
I would say it's about time.
And I think it's important for our nation, too, to have that realization of sacrifice.
Where did we find such men? We find them where we've always found them. In our villages and towns, on our city streets, in our shops and on our farms. It's time to show our pride in them and to thank them.
Above and beyond the call of duty.
Above and beyond the call of duty.